Okay, so 37 days ago, we came up with the idea to have a local podcast, and I have some lessons that I need to share with you. So we're gonna save you some heartache, and that's coming right up. Hey everyone, if we are meeting for the first time, my name is Rich Cardona. I produce some of the world's top podcasts. I am a podcast producer, I have an amazing team behind it, and my wife is on this podcast that we just started not long ago. I've been absent from the podcast game, and I wanted to get back into it. Chose to do one here locally in Wilmington, North Carolina, where we go interview businesses. Now, some of this may not apply to you if you're doing virtual interviews or if you're not doing anything in person, but I do believe a lot of the lessons still apply. So here is the update from all the previous videos. If you want more background, definitely go back. You're gonna see how we came up with the idea, how we decided what the pros and cons were, how we reached out to people, and all that good stuff. But as of now, 37 days in, I've probably spent a total of about 10 hours on this project. And what that means is we recorded 4 podcasts in person at the businesses, okay? So that evolution altogether per one is about an hour. It's about 15 minutes, 20 minutes of setting up, 20 to 30 minutes of the actual interview, then tearing down and talking to them a little bit, telling them about next steps. So that's about all the time we've committed to it, but it doesn't mean that it didn't come without any kind of learning issues. Now, this is important for you to know because you want to be a part-time podcaster, but you want your podcast to be full-time. And that's why we're doing this, to walk you through it. So let's start with the first major factor. Now in videos just like this, or YouTube videos or podcasts, doesn't matter what it is, you gotta try and keep the video interesting. And if you're not a super creative person like myself, then what you're gonna do is rely on a lot of things that a video editor could do for you. We could do transitions like this. We could do sound effects to make it cool. We could punch in. We could punch out. We could go to black and white. We could go back to color. You could do text across the screen just like this. There's a lot of different things you could do, but the whole name of the game is trying to keep people's attention. In the absence of another camera, which may be able to show people different angles of you, what you want is B-roll. Now, B-roll is essentially images or video that relate to what you are talking about. So if I'm talking about my time in the Marine Corps or as a pilot or any of those things, then we might probably want to have footage of that. If I'm interviewing someone about their restaurant business and they're talking about their top dishes, we want to make sure that we get videos or images of that. Now, a lot of people use stock imagery in a lot of their YouTube content or whatever, and that's totally fine. But in this case, I want to give the businesses that we're interviewing like a really good experience. Plus, I want the audience to go to these places. So why is this a problem? It's a necessity, but why is it a problem? The problem is we can't get the B-roll in advance. So what happens is we do the interview, and then after the interview, it's like, oh, they mentioned this, we should get that. Oh, we need to get signage. Oh, they said the new entrance is over here. Oh, anything they mention that is potential B-roll we want to get. Now the issue is after the interview is not usually the ideal time to get it. These people already committed some of their time, and it doesn't mean they're gonna be available for us to go do our business and get the B-roll. So what happens is this is the drawback. We have to get in touch with them afterwards and then go get it. So is that gonna be a problem for you? Maybe, maybe not. But we just showed our first guest their episode and they were like madly in love with it. We had one spelling mistake in it for one of the person's names, which is forgivable, but everything else they loved, and they loved how we tied B-roll of downtown Wilmington to it. So it was worth it. They're gonna be happy, which means the audience is probably gonna be happy as well. So that was number one. Number two is learning curve, okay? We are not profitable. My business is basically paying for this, and we haven't really accrued any costs, but the podcast itself is not a profitable entity. But that doesn't mean we don't need help. So there's a videographer I met, and this is an amazing gentleman. His name is Joe. We went to our second interview, and in one of the camera angles, we use 3 cameras, one of the camera angles is out of focus. So this is just a learning curve thing. So in my opinion, like you should be going around to every camera throughout, making sure everything's good to go. But these spaces don't necessarily do that. He didn't want to be distracting. He's monitoring audio from the actual audio recorder and not the camera. So there's a lot going on. But one of the shots is almost unusable because there's a table that's in focus and it's a wide shot. And then we are out of focus slightly, just enough for me to be like, oh, I don't know, if we should use this. And we are not able, so I guess this is number 3 as well. If you're doing something in person or if you're interviewing someone virtually, you don't know what their background's gonna look like. You don't know what the space is gonna look like. You don't know if there's gonna be distractions noise-wise, light-wise, and in a couple of cases there were. It was just really challenging to make sure we're able to plug in everything we need to do in the right places and have good aesthetics. How can we get around that? We could obviously just go to the space, go to the business beforehand, check it out and imagine it. And then if we want those people on our podcast, then we could talk to them about it and we already kind of have an idea in mind. That was number 2 and 3. Let's go on to number 4. Host energy, okay? Now, this may sound like I'm making derogatory comments about my wife, but I'm not. We just don't have it yet as a podcast co-host. Okay, I had a world-ranked top podcast with a good friend of mine, Heather Parody. We had a podcast that exploded, and one of the things that we always were told was that our energy was so fluid and we bounced off each other really well. My wife is not a podcaster. Heather had 1 million podcast episodes recorded before we teamed up, and I had a ton as well, so the experience was there. So she and I, we're just not picking off each other's sentences yet. We just need to be a little bit more organized, and plan who's gonna ask what and how are we gonna treat these situations. So host energy is not necessarily energy as much as it is fluidity. So just keep that in mind. If you are co-hosting with someone, there is gonna be a learning curve. And even though I'm a podcaster and she's not, it doesn't mean that I should carry it or do most of the talking or anything like that. We really wanna come across to the audience and to the guest the right way. Now, number 5 may not apply, but it's just hear me out. We've interviewed 4 businesses. In the 2 interviews we did with the owners, there was a good amount of storytelling and it was just more interesting. If you're interviewing operations personnel or a general manager, I think they are such a part of the business that they want to just promote it, and that's fine. That's what we want to happen. But the owners, there's just more heartstrings in those stories, right? You hear the struggle, you hear the successes, you hear the peaks and the valleys, you hear how they came up with some of the items. They were not plugged into something, they created something. And I think that is just something that we learned and we didn't really expect. So now we're kind of just on this thing where it's we're gonna be interviewing the owners, that's gonna be better content. Number 6, see this thing right here? I have my notes for this, okay? I'm not trying to have a script and I'm not trying to read off a prompter. If I need this, I'm gonna have it out. And if you're a podcaster, look at how many people have an iPad out or have their notes out. Just think of a news reporter. They don't care if they're shuffling around their papers, finishing a story or making sure they cover a certain point. We did not do that. So we kind of got lost in some of the questions and they were sequential in a very specific order. But we didn't have an iPad or a phone out because we were trying to be present, but it actually makes us lose focus a little bit because you are gonna be anticipating certain things that you wanna make sure you ask and you might forget. So have the iPad out. We learned our lesson. We're gonna have a little checklist out and it's gonna break out who's asking what and certain things we wanna cover. And number 7 is going to be checklists. As I mentioned earlier, I was a pilot in the Marine Corps and checklists were everything. I mean, I cannot explain to you the depth of the manuals we use, the emergency procedures, the training, the operations, everything. It doesn't matter how many times you've flown that aircraft, how many times you started it or turned it off or flew. It doesn't matter. You needed to use a checklist. Now, this is not us operating an aircraft, but using a checklist for setup, for teardown, for post-production, for uploading, all those kinds of things matters, and it's gonna be one of the only ways you don't forget. So don't wing it, pun intended. And last but not least is cold feet. When we've approached people, everyone by far has been overwhelming, yes, we'd love that, that's amazing, Some people even asked us what it would cost for nothing. And that's something that we're doing right now. We have the ability to do that, but in the future, if people are hey, we wanna pay to be on your podcast, sure, no problem, we'd probably entertain that. But they're thrilled, okay? They're thrilled at the opportunity. They believe it's gonna be excellent, that they get YouTube content out of it, that they're on a podcast, that there's Facebook content, Instagram content about them, no problem. But once it gets time to the planning, it was just kind of funny. I mean, this happens with my clients sometimes. They delay and disrupt. Something comes up, someone doesn't want to be on camera, we got so much going on, and I'm okay. And we've already learned at this point to be no problem, hey, we're gonna move on to another business. We don't do restaurants the whole time, or we don't do coffee shops the whole time. We are doing business is in Wilmington, not just food, not just drinks. We could do all kinds of things. So we've learned that people will get cold feet. Sometimes they need a little bit of prompting and it will work out. The people who were kind of squeamish about being on ended up having an amazing interview and they were so glad they did it. But just know that even if you and your own podcast are gonna have guests, that people might change their mind and get scared. But more than likely, they're gonna be excited at the opportunity to get in front of your audience. So I'm gonna continue this next video with probably our first episode episode so you could check it out. But look, go back to some of the previous videos. If you have not subscribed yet, subscribe and hit the bell so that way you could kind of see us documenting the journey, capturing what we're doing, and following along. All these little things, I told you, 10 hours total in about 37 days. And if we were not doing anything in person and it was just virtual, I guarantee you it would be less than half of that time. I want you to be able to succeed with a podcast that looks full-time, but that when you at the end of the day know you are only a part-time podcaster. This content machine is going to be very worth your while. We're going to keep walking you through it. See you next time.